Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Kitabkhana Live. We are here today to talk about a relevant book for the current times, a long game on how Chinese negotiate with India. India's relations with the People's Republic of China have captured the popular imagination ever since the 1950s, but have rarely merited a detailed understanding of the issues. Individual episodes tend to arouse lively debate, which often dissipates without a deeper exploration of the factors that shape the outcomes. This book explores the dynamics of negotiation between the two countries from the early years after independence until the current times through the six historical and recent events in the Indo-China relationship. To talk about the book, we have the author and former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, Sri Vijay Gokhale, who would be in conversation with Senior Associate Editor from ThePrint, Nayanima Basu. The session will be moderated by Professor Ashwani Kumar, an expert on international relations, presently Dean School of Development Studies at TISS, Mumbai. Before I hand it over to Professor Ashwani Kumar, to note, we would be taking questions in the last 15 minutes of the session. Do share your questions in the comment box below. In case you would like to order a copy of the book, do DM on our social channels. Over to you, Ashwani.
You're mute.
Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. This mute and unmute has become, a new online experience, a new lingo, Every time I hear, I go to my classroom, I tell people, check it out whether I'm muted or unmuted. So thank you very much for friends. Mr. Gokhale is no stranger to us. His book, The Long Game, has been doing fantastic all over. And Nayanima, welcome, Nayanima. Very kind of you and very kind of print. So I must tell audience and my friends here, writer friends here, that this event that's taking place at Kitabkhana is a collaboration between the print, Penguin and Kitabkhana, and I'm here from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, moderating, nudging, perhaps provoking both Mr. Gokhale and Nayanima on some issues. You can afford to keep silent, maintain the diplomatic silence, the golden silence. And Nayanima, you can be as provocative as you have been always been. Let me just speak a little bit about our distinguished guest, both Mr. Gokhale and Basu. Mr. Gokhale is not just one of the most distinguished scholars on foreign policy in India. We all know that he is our former Indian Foreign Service Secretary. And prior to his term as Foreign Secretary, Mr. Gokhale had served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia as Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, and also Ambassador of India to the People's Republic of China from January 2016 to October 17. He has also served as head of the India-Thai Pi Association, And also, if you remember, Mr. Gokhale has worked extensively on matters relating to Indo-Pacific region with a special emphasis on Chinese politics and diplomacy. Mr. Gokhale, since his retirement, has been contributing his essays, pieces, and also authoring books on China. Currently, he lives in Pune, and also working with Rashtriya Raksha University in Gujarat. And my friends, Mr. Gokhale speaks many languages: English, Hindi, Marathi, and Mandarin Chinese. Nayanima, welcome. Nayanima, welcome very much. A widely reputed journalist, author, working with ThePrint, covering diplomacy and strategic affairs. And friends, Nayanima will, somehow, will also at some point of time will share her Kabul experiences. So I think, before we, move on to the long game, Vijay sir, kindly just, tell about your own, career as a diplomat. You started from St. Stephen's College, spent almost 40 years in the foreign service. And still, when we look at the foreign service, it's still very small, infrastructure we have. We have almost 400 to 600 officials compared to China. If I'm not wrong, they have about 3,000 to 5,000 officials, foreign officers. So how do you look at a career before we take off, conversation on the long game?
Thank you, Professor Ashwani Kumar. Thank you for chairing today's session, and I'm delighted to be on the panel with Nayanima Basu, a senior media person whom we have known each other for some years. Professor Ashwani, I always had an interest in international affairs, even as a teenager and subsequently in the university. But as you know, the civil services examination is all luck and nothing else. So I decided to chance my hand at it. And quite frankly, I was myself surprised that I got through. But having got through, I very early on decided that specialization was important. I felt this was the case because I had seen my father, who was in the private sector, who always used to say that the age of generalization was over and the age of specialization had come. So I decided to pick Chinese as a language and to specialize on China, not just because I was quite fascinated by China, but also because it was a neighbor with whom we had had a troubled relationship. And frankly, I have not regretted my decision to specialize on Chinese affairs for even one day after that. I was very fortunate to be posted in Beijing 3 times, each of them at turning points in the relationship. The first time when the Tiananmen incident of 1989 took place, the second time when the nuclear tests took place, and the third time when the Doklam incident took place. So in a sense, history and chance also put me at the center of things at 3 very exciting phases of our relationship. And when I retired after 40 years, I felt that there were so many Indians who were curious to know about China, but very few Indian authors, because most of the writing is Western, mostly American. And to my mind, 1.3 billion Indians ought to hear about China, read about China, learn about China from other Indians, not necessarily from outsiders. This is particularly so because China is our neighbor. Understanding China is something that all Indians should know about, and that's the reason why I have decided to write these books.
Nayanima, you have already reflected on the long game, So compared to, the Tiananmen Square book and the long game, which do you find most fascinating? Because Tiananmen Square is a really spectacle, an event that really shook our conscience also. I mean, like if I'm right, it's about, about the incident that I can never ever forget. I mean, like when the footage started coming in, the pictures started coming in, we were shocked on the campus. But now the long game, because long game and anima refers to our relationship, a historic relationship, civilizational relationship, and also Mr. Gokhale has looked at 6 historical events and tried to capture the essence of, what could be the relationship policy, with regard to China. So how do you look at Nayanima, the book, the long game?
Well, thank you for having me on this. It's an honor to be on this panel with Gokhale sir and of course with you, Professor Kumar. So, well, it's a very difficult question for me. I mean, as difficult as it can be. How can I choose between the two? But both are fascinating. Both have been, keeping me engaged at least since the time both the books came out. And I told sir that, it is just, I mean, you have so many books on Tiananmen Square, but this one is like the eyewitness and how he felt it. Every corner of the street that he has described, it's just fascinating. It just transcends you there. So that's a feeling that one gets by reading that book, and so much that you realize that you did not know, no matter how many books you've read on that, with due respect to others who've written on it. But this book, Long Game, I think was highly required, especially in today's times, especially at least for people like me, journalists, who know so less at times as to understand how the Chinese really negotiate. And that's something which has been so intriguing. We know for a fact that yes, as Sir said, that to be a diplomat, understanding that language is definitely an asset, but negotiating skill is something altogether is different. And I know that for a fact, in the sense, I've been covering international trade also for a very long time, as long as I've been in journalism now for about 17 years. So I've always heard, especially from our negotiators in Commerce Ministry, that how negotiating is a completely different skill that you need to have. And I think this book really sort of tells you how the negotiating aspect has also changed for both countries. The first few case studies is something that I was not aware of. I've only read about that in the book. But when you see what actually happened, the backstory of it and how it happened, how they negotiated, and how also eventually India also learned to understand how to negotiate with the Chinese, I think is fascinating. And as I've told Sir many times, I think the quality that he has is to bring all this complex thing within just few pages, so that one really can read on the go and yet catch up on your work without making it a thick book. So I think that's an immense quality Sir has, and it is fascinating. So both the books are absolutely a must read for everyone who's even remotely interested in China. So yeah.
Mr. Gokhale, what's your favorite? I guess you are writing another book, I'm told. Your papers are there, Galwan papers are there. You're very prolific these days, extensively writing.
Well, Tiananmen Square was born out of my passion for China,
Yeah.
and also because I was an eyewitness to some of those events. So this book was writing itself in my mind for 30 years, and the only problem was that I was serving in government, so I was not able to write about it. The long game is not from the heart; it is more from the head. Because it required much more thinking, and the real objective was to sort of uh, create something which people could build upon. So, on this platform, I do want to say two things. Firstly, this book is not about criticizing Indian foreign policy. Rightfully, some of my readers have said that I was a little harsh on India's first Prime Minister, but that was not really the intention.
No, I was
Because
coming. I was coming to Mr. Gokhale. I was coming to that,
yeah.
and in fact, I wanted to provoke you because it seems to us on campus that with due respect to Nehru and the Nehruvian idea of India, it seems that when you said that wishful thinking, blinkered, and I was thinking about Brigadier Dalway's book. I was thinking about calls, General Calls stuff. But seems that Nehru and China, I guess you can't junk Nehru, abandon Nehru when you are reflecting on China.
Yes. No, I think the point is, first of all, we must admit that it is always easier to have 20/20 vision in hindsight. And this is not available either to the negotiator or to the decision maker. And as a negotiator myself, I appreciated it. So, first of all, I think that to expect Prime Minister Nehru or any subsequent Prime Minister to have 20/20 vision is not a realistic assumption. But on the other hand, I think there is evidence, some of which I have presented in the book, to suggest that information was available at hand and advice was also available at hand on the need to proceed with a certain degree of caution. And perhaps that was not heeded or not heeded adequately. But be that as it may, as I said, that was not the purpose of the book. The purpose was to start the conversation about how the Chinese negotiate and hopefully to encourage other institutions and other authors to build upon it. Because frankly, Professor Ashwani and Nayanima, when I started looking around for books on this subject, all I found were American authors. And how an American negotiates with China cannot suo motu be applied to Indians. America is the bigger power, and it certainly was the bigger power. It negotiated from a position of strength. In the case of India-China relations, the Chinese think they are the bigger power. So our absorbing lessons from the US may not necessarily translate into good negotiation. Therefore, the idea was to write about this in an interesting way for an average Indian to read, and also hopefully for academics to build upon. That was the real objective of the book.
Nayanima, your response. Nayanima, your response.
No, I mean, what can I say? It's absolutely correct. As I said, that you get so many books on this, many issues that sir has touched upon. Especially, I mean, in the long game, all these 5-6 agreements. Yes, you read about it in various little aspects, but the way the back history about it has been done and how it has been negotiated, I think is fascinating. And I don't think in the first few chapters there's been a criticism, but if that's the fact, that's the fact. The fact that more homework needed to be done probably before I mean, India had sort of was embracing China at that point of time when things were available as early as 1930s. So I believe that is what we've learned from history. I think India now reads and does its research a lot. I'm not saying we have become an expert in this, but we at least know today where to begin with. If the Chinese are saying something, if they have said that before, or is it the first time they're saying something. So yeah, I think that is what the book actually will help everyone in the future. Also, if there is any other agreement that comes up, there's this talk going on that probably the CBMs can be reviewed, the confidence building measures, which External Affairs Minister had stated last year, along with the Chinese foreign minister. So if they really, there is a discussion and negotiations start on the new set of CBMs, I believe this book will definitely be something that will tell them what not to do. So, yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Gokhale, if I ask you, both you, Nayanima covers international relations, diplomacy, international trade, and here is the long game, What is the major takeaway from the long game, And why did you call it long game, I mean, long game because it seems to me that the Chinese are provoking us through series of, incidents. Provocations come in a small, little Galwan and other incidents, if I put together. So why did you call it long game, Nayanima,
that's an interesting question. Nobody has ever asked me this before.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So you're the first one.
Thank you.
The reason I called it, or I suggested this title, and the publishers were kind enough to agree to it, was because diplomacy is not an event-based act. It is a process. And if we recall, for instance, the many conversations the Americans and the Soviets had before we got nuclear non-proliferation going, or the many years that have passed on the Iran nuclear deal, or the many years that were spent in bringing the warring Europeans together into a European Union, then you understand that the game cannot be played episodically. It cannot be, nothing can be achieved when two governments or more than two governments are talking within a finite time frame. It took a while for us to understand this. And this is not our fault, because when the British conquered India around the late 18th century, it extinguished Indian independence completely. The result was we didn't have any diplomatic experience, or very little diplomatic experience, when we became independent. We had to relearn the whole thing. The Chinese, on the other hand, had a tradition of diplomacy right up to 1949, because their independence was never completely extinguished. The colonial powers took the choicest bits of China, but allowed the Chinese empire to govern the rest. So the diplomacy was always available to the Chinese. Now, therefore, the Chinese understood that diplomacy was a long game and not something that could yield an outcome in 1, 2, 3, or 4 meetings. And it has taken us a while to learn that. But as Nayanima pointed out in her opening remarks, I think we have begun to learn how to deal with China and how to handle them. This is not, of course, to say that we are very good at it or that we can't improve, but certainly I don't think the mistakes of the 50s or the early 60s is likely to be repeated again. And that's the reason I called it the long game.
Mr. Gokhale and Nayanima and Samir Sumaya, welcome back. There is a very meaty, I mean, like the very chunky part in your book about, perceptions, Chinese perception. And in the foreign policy, if I'm going to shake hand with Mr. Mao, the revolutionary, I think the world will notice, isn't it? I'm not sure if Mao and Nehru ever shook hands. Do you recall, the handshaking when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi visited? I think the great handshake that took place. What's that? Metaphorical. The significance. But because Chinese have this great ability to communicate to the world, perhaps far more effectively than us. Am I provoking you?
No, you're actually hit the nail on the head, Professor Ashwani. And that is, in a communist system or in an authoritarian system, propaganda or publicity is a very vital part of legitimacy. You see, the difference between the Indian state and the Chinese state was that in 1947, the Indian National Congress, which was basically a movement for freedom, converted itself into a government through constitutional means. We elect our prime ministers, they lose, a new prime minister comes in. So legitimacy came through the constitution. In China, of course, the Communist Party, on liberating China from the nationalists, simply became the state itself. And therefore, its legitimacy derives from how the public perceives it, because the public doesn't have an opportunity to actually vote. And therefore, propaganda, perception building, always being conscious of how the rest would view you, has always been a part of the Chinese diplomatic lexicon. Now, this has been a shortcoming on our part. I readily agree to that. But I think in more recent times, we too have understood that perception is as important as reality in such matters. Now, this is a good question for Nayanima to answer because she builds perception, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah.
So let's hear her take on it.
Yeah, Nayanima, please tell us. Please tell us. You see, Mr. Gokhale is just back from Kabul. And I will take you through Kabul also.
I read her pieces.
And I'm taking a long game through Kabul also. I'm going to ask that question, Nayanima.
No, thank you. So, no, as Sir said that, yes, I mean, there is this perception. I mean, we in the media, we get the perception, whatever we get to hear from all sides. And I think, after you read Long Game, you realize so much effort goes into it. I mean, it's not to say that as if before the book we did not realize the effort that is put in it, but now you realize the kind of hurdles that you face, other kind of hurdles that you face, especially when you deal with the Chinese, which is why I feel maybe the Ministry of External Affairs need to open up more, need to probably brief at least its own reporters off record to make us realize that, okay, if let's say a listing of Masood Azhar is not happening, then why is it not happening? And that is where, as Sir said, that, when we write, there's a perception that is built up. So, if we in the media are not getting the right information, how can we also, give it to the public, in a sense? Because there is so much, especially in today's world, when you have a Twitter constantly there, questioning you for every line that you write, probably in your book or in your article, is that, why is India not able to do it? How difficult it is to list a terrorist like Masood Azhar? But when you read this chapter, really, you understand what has gone through in this last 10 years and how difficult it has been. So I think that is, to me, as you asked, Professor Kumar, is the biggest takeaway. And also, the part that Sir has written on the Chiang Kai-shek regime, how they stated after India's independence that, they do not believe that the similar agreement of 1914 is valid anymore. All these things, I do not know how many books have dealt with it, but as Sir has rightly put in his book, so when Prime Minister Nehru was strategically going to embrace China, he was aware about these things, or maybe he wasn't. But these were public statements that were made from the Chinese side, be it the Chiang Kai-shek regime or the Communist Party. And today you have, I think, the scene has all the more changed when you have party negotiating and parallelly the state also negotiating. And end of the day, they look like a monolithic entity, but they are not. And I think in one of the discussions, Sir has also stated that unlike other countries with Chinese negotiators, you don't really build a long-term friendship. I guess once they're done with their job, they go away from the scene, and you can never find them ever again. So I think that also probably is one of the points which have not really brought these countries closer after so many years. We've dealt with them with trade and many other aspects. They could be our biggest trading partner, but then why they are not close is basically because of these small reasons. I think The Long Game is really a fascinating title. I think after the great game, it is the long game. And you really feel that, that is how you can divide the world. This side is the great game, which is probably a great game 2.0. We are seeing will happen again. And here is this long game. And I think that is what makes it all the more fascinating.
So may I come in here and provoke both of you? So if I look at the long game, and I'm gonna ask Mr. Gokhale very clearly, rather provoking him. So when I read Chinese foreign policy or the Chinese history, and let's forget about 62. What has happened. But it seems that, do you think that there is any durable solution or lasting solution to the irritants like Tawang Valley? What's going to happen? And what about Aksai Chin? Do you think, being in China, posted in China, you have been part of several negotiations, several kind of boundary negotiations? Do you think there is going to be, if I have to break a news to the world, how I'm going to break news, that I was talking to Mr. Gokhale and he gave me this solution, because as a professor, when we go around, people ask me, will you give me a solution? Will they accept the McMahon line, or will you not accept McMahon line? Nayanima and Mr. Gokhale, do you think?
Thank you, Professor Ashwani. See, during my career of 40 years, I have felt that solutions can be found to all issues. What is required is political will. And sometimes that is easier, but sometimes it is difficult, particularly when you are altering the cartographic boundary of India, which all of us from the time we were children have sort of internalized and instinctively react to. So it takes political will, it takes political courage, it takes political capital to do this. But we have, for instance, done it very recently in the case of Bangladesh. And even in the case of Nepal, barring a very tiny fragment which is under dispute, we have been able to settle the rest of the border. So firstly, I don't think we should be pessimistic. However, as they say, you need two to tango. So even if you are willing and the other side is not, you won't make progress. Now, my main contention is that for an agreement to emerge, both parties have to have two qualities. They have to look at the other party as a relative equal in terms of the negotiation. I mean, you may be a big country or a small country or a rich country or a poor country, but for purposes of negotiation, you have to behave as equals. That's the first. And the second is there has to be a willingness to compromise. Now, as far as the Indian state is concerned, I think we have always given China a very respectable, appropriate place in our foreign policy. Even when we treat them as an adversary or as a friend, we give them an appropriate place. It is always has an important place when any foreign policy initiative is taken by any government to India, from Prime Minister Nehru to Prime Minister Modi. I'm not sure that the Chinese have approached us in the same way. The Chinese have always believed, right from Mao to Xi, the leadership, that China somehow has a higher place in the international hierarchy. because she is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, because she is a nuclear weapon state. More importantly, because historically China has always believed that it is the #1 country for the last 2000 years, although that is debatable, because although India may not have been one political entity, but Indian civilization certainly for large parts was the largest economy and certainly a very influential civilization. The short point is, unless the Chinese also see us as a relative equal and accept that we are a country with which they can build mutual trust, our willingness to settle the border is not going to yield an outcome. Now, the Chinese will, of course, argue conversely. They will say that they are always ready, the Indian side is not. That is a matter for negotiation eventually, and as and when that happens. But I feel that there is not enough understanding on the Chinese side about India. And therefore, the same complaint would be there by Chinese readers about India. Just as there is very little writing by Indians for Indians on China, there is also relatively less writing by Chinese for Chinese on India. China's focus was the West. India's focus perhaps was also the West. So the result is, hopefully these books that I'm writing, a number of other good books have come out on China recently, will start filling that gap.
Nayanima, do you think, Nayanima, I'm kind of looking at, these irritants, do you think, Nayanima, the Galwan will again happen? I'm not sure.
Well, it is very difficult for me to say. I'm a journalist, so I would, for me, anything that Galwan happens, it is unfortunate, and we have to report. And I think it should not happen. And the fact that, as I said, that if both countries walk the talk that they do, and Sir is aware, when Sir was Foreign Secretary, we had this informal summits again, that gave us so much of hope that maybe, these two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, they're coming together and they're talking difficult issues in a very unusual format, relaxed and chilled out. So, but then we've seen that, how the Chinese have remained Chinese. So, all these informal summits maybe did not go down well with them, or maybe they just saw it as yet another, probably an obligation, one never knows. But at least India has now learned a lesson, I would say. But then again, the point is, as External Affairs Minister said, that there cannot be business as usual unless there is silence on the border, which I think probably could be difficult for us going forward, that we see now how Chinese are now, China as a country, their influence, the deep pockets that they have, their Belt and Road Initiative, how they're coming in the neighborhood. Now they're going to probably play a larger role in Afghanistan. So I think India needs to now understand and realize that whether or not its role is diminishing in the regard of the fact that whether too much reliance with the West, with this Quad and everything, Indo-Pacific, where is it that we can also, have a larger say and role? But yes, I understand India has to always stand up for democratic principles, the rule-based order, something that, unlike the Chinese, we cannot overlook. We cannot just say, okay, we do not follow certain international arbitration. So, to come back to your question, I hope there is not going to be any other Galwan incident. I think we've learned a lesson. I think the Chinese have also learned a lesson that, you cannot push India beyond a point. I think probably now is the time for these two countries to really quickly disengage. And as both the ministers last year had stated, maybe it is time to look after review the border agreements and the confidence building measures, because then had we had more contemporary CBMs, we probably would not have lost 20 soldiers. So I think, but then this is not for me to decide or to comment upon. There are many experts, diplomats, we have our entire government on that. But I believe these are the lessons India needs to learn, and I think China has also learned a lot. So that's my point, and I really hope there is not going to be any other Galwan at all.
Mr. Gokhale, just as a foreign secretary, I'm coming back. I'm sure that you can prefer to maintain diplomatic silence, the golden silence, What was your own understanding in the hot seat, How did you look at China? Because your book, The Long Game, for me, as somebody working on international relations and foreign affairs, have some exposure to the foreign policy. I guess the long game also refers to, these processes, and the mechanism that would continue, in future. Because in the book you refer to a power asymmetry between China and India. You refer to that. So when you were foreign secretary, how did you handle it? In terms of the
Well,
military power asymmetry.
yeah, I think from my perspective, Professor Ashwani, firstly, China's rise is the most consequential development of our times. So there is no possibility of wishing away the fact that China will not only remain a neighbor, but an increasingly powerful one.
Yeah.
The second point was that we must recognize that in the past 20 years, the Chinese have very significantly pulled away from us in the race. So, in the year 2000, for instance, our GDP was exactly half of China's. We were about 496 billion US dollars. China was just a shade over $1 trillion. Yet in 20 years, they are now 5 times our size. We are 3 trillion, they are 15 trillion. Consequently, military expenditure has gone up, its global influence has gone up, its diplomatic power has gone up. So they've pulled ahead of us. Now, that doesn't mean this will be a permanent arrangement because we can very well catch up. China herself has shown this example. But at the moment, we have to recognize we are dealing with a consequential power with a much bigger capacity. And I do believe that those working in government don't have the luxury of speculating what might happen. They have to deal with certain obvious realities with which they are presented. In those circumstances, I think all governments of India have believed that engagement with China is important. So whether it was Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee or Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh or Prime Minister Narendra Modi, all of them have tried in their own way, in their own style. The style may differ, that depends on individuals, to reach out to the Chinese side. At the same time, I think they were all deeply conscious, all of India's leaders, irrespective of which political party they came from, that we had a troubled history. And that therefore, while we can hope for the best, we ought to also ensure that our diplomacy gives us flexibility. And that was the reason why from 1998, the government of India began the policy of multi-alignment. This is a word that the current minister, External Affairs Minister, uses. In other words, we opened relations with the United States, we maintained relations with Russia, we opened much closer relations with Germany, with France, with Japan, which was important, while we engaged with China. Now, at the end of it all, of course, as I said, the two countries in their own bilateral issues have to deal on the basis of trust. That trust is sorely lacking in the relationship. And I think Nayanima alluded to the fact that the incident in Galwan has eroded that trust to a point where the old relationship is not sustainable anymore. Now, what kind of new relationship will come is anybody's guess. But I do agree with Nayanima that, while we hope that nothing will happen in the border areas, but on the other hand, I think we would be deluding ourselves if we imagine that the Chinese side will not make further attempts. And therefore, we have to prepare for it. Nonetheless, there is no alternative to engagement because really the other side of diplomacy is conflict. If you fail in diplomacy, the only way you can resolve it is through conflict, and we don't want to get to that point. I don't know whether Nayanima has a different opinion, but this was certainly the sort of the frame in which I functioned as Foreign Secretary, and which I believe all the governments, at least for the last 20 years, have functioned with respect to China policy, give and take nuances which happen because different political parties and different political personalities come to power.
So, what was your advice to the ambassador in China when you were foreign secretary? On a lighter note, what did you advise him?
When I was foreign secretary, we had the last major problem, which was the Doklam issue, had been done.
Doklam, yeah.
So the 2 years that I was foreign secretary, in fact, we were. I think the objective of the government was precisely to re-engage. Now, the informal summits that were held, there was no expectation on the Indian side that we would come up with concrete outcomes. That never happens at that level. The two leaders neither have any detailed and specific technical knowledge, nor is it a situation where two leaders can sit together and come up miraculously with a solution. So, if there were expectations that they were going to meet and resolve matters, I think this is not what summit level diplomacy is. Summit level diplomacy is an effort to try and sort of build relationships and talk to each other. And I think that despite what happened in 2020, the interactions between the two leaders gives me the hope that there is some kind of a sort of mutual understanding of each other, and it will hold us in good stead in the years to come. But of course, I can't predict what each government will do. I'm no longer in government.
No, so you have seen, I'm bringing Nayanima also, again provoking you. Tell me something about, the President Xi Jinping and our prime ministers, personal chemistry. You were the foreign secretary, you handle negotiation and the meetings, What is the chemistry between them, Does it matter?
First of all, let me tell you that our current prime minister has he's a great communicator. There's no doubt about it. So not just President Xi Jinping, but I think leadership across the world finds it easy to do business with our prime minister, because the prime minister appears to be in command of information, doesn't necessarily have to look at notes, prepares in considerable detail when such meetings take place, and so on. My impression about President Xi Jinping, and obviously that is an impression, is that after Deng Xiaoping, he is perhaps the first Chinese leader who also does not refer to notes in a meeting, who can speak extempore. And I say this with some degree of confidence because I have actually sat in meetings with all Chinese leaders from Deng Xiaoping, including Deng Xiaoping, up to Xi Jinping. So I've seen Deng Xiaoping and then Chao Ziyang and then Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, and now Xi Jinping. So what I can say is that no other Chinese leader spoke extempore, spoke without notes, deviated from the agenda. I think this shows a degree of confidence, personal confidence. That leads me to the belief that therefore these are two leaders who do not necessarily get manipulated by their advisors or bureaucracies, that they are able to think for themselves. And I think that's a big asset. But ultimately, relations between countries are not just between personalities. There is a history to it, there is a context to it, there are issues which are emotive on both sides, there are issues which have deep interest on both sides, commercial interests, defense interests, various other interest groups. All of that comes together to form a policy. So while leaderships are important, ultimately it is a whole of nation effort. And I think foreign policy has to be a whole of nation effort. It can't be an individual effort or an effort just of the External Affairs Ministry. I mean, this is my perspective as a former civil servant, and I reflect this in my book. But Nayanima, maybe you have a different perspective. So I think you should also share your view.
Nayanima, please. Nayanima, about the personal chemistry.
Agree. I mean, the other side of diplomacy is conflict, and I don't think either India, I don't know about China, but India, I don't think we can afford a conflict at this point of time, especially after the pandemics, the economic situation, job growth, many things are at, in a very difficult position. So, and I believe what sir is saying that, you got to engage, and that's what my point was, that, how long can you not talk? How long can you not engage? But then again, I mean, with India and China, if you see the aspect of the relationship, which is the most common aspect, which is the trade aspect. I remember in 2010, there were these reports that I was writing at that point of time. I was in with Business Standard, and we were writing that, okay, trade deficit between India and China is reaching 20 billion. And today we have exceeded 60 billion. So, and India has always been, I would say, on the losing side of it. While we have given so much of leverage to Chinese exports, we've opened the market to them, although they still sort of complain that why India walked out of RCEP. But then, frankly, I mean, the market was all open to them, yes, subject to certain checks and balances. But look at what, I mean, if you look at only at the economic aspect, we've not been able to expand our export basket in China. India was very keen to enhance its exports on pharmaceuticals, on IT products, which India has not been able to do, mostly because, yes, one, there is a language issue which our exporters keep talking about. But then also there is this fact that, the Chinese have had always this feeling, and that Sir has also written, not from the export aspect, but the fact that they have this superiority thing, which I would say superiority complex, that we are this great power, we are the permanent member of the UNSC, and we enjoy a higher status than India. And I think that is where probably the problem rises. And I think they have never really put India at the same pedestal, never really seen India as a partner, which I think maybe time will tell whether they change or not. But I think that is something that India has learned now, and which is why we have taken this stance. But again, as I said, that for me, and as a journalist, I would always say that India has to engage with as many countries as possible. Yes, you have a difficult neighborhood. You have a Pakistan this side, you have a China on the other hand. And while we talk about a two-front war, I don't really think anybody is keen on that. At least not the common man on the street would want that. That's the last thing one would need to see happening. But so I think you really need to talk, and that is where I totally and have always trusted the fantastic, stellar diplomats that India has always produced. And I think that is always necessary to understand and engage with the world, no matter how difficult the world becomes. And it is going to be a much more difficult world post-pandemic, especially for the coming generation whose life is just online. So for them to understand how to do personal interactions, negotiations, I'm sure, I'm also a mother, so I know I worry about the fact that whether my son will become one day a good diplomat or maybe a journalist or whatever, if they just sit in front of the computer all the time and talk to their friends. So, I mean, I'm just giving a very lay example, but then, this is where we need to understand how the world needs to come closer, and you need to discuss and you need to talk, no matter how difficult a neighbor that you have. So that's
Mr. Gokhale, I'm also getting some questions from the audience, and they want to hear what you say about Taliban, China, and Islamabad. What is this new nexus, Kabul, Beijing, and Islamabad? Do you think that would radically alter or impact our foreign policy?
Professor Ashwani, I have a bit of a counterintuitive argument to this. One of the things I have sort of gathered in my long experience of working in China is that the Chinese do not engage friends. They engage with countries or people with whom they have concerns or problems. And therefore, the whole approach of the Chinese to the Taliban is one, not necessarily suggesting there is friendship between them, but suggesting concern on the Chinese part. And to some extent, there are good reasons for that concern. Remember, territorially, although China shares a common boundary with Afghanistan, it may be small, the Wakhan corridor, but it's a boundary. And therefore, China has legitimate grounds, similar to the grounds that India has, about the possible spillover of fundamentalism and terrorism and separatism from those groups which were sheltered by the Taliban and which we hope won't be sheltered now, but we can't say. So, one reason for that engagement is a legitimate concern of fear and an attempt to redress that fear by getting some kind of assurances from the Taliban government. I am fairly confident because China, the Chinese are a very smart bunch of diplomats, will take any assurances they receive very cautiously and will look at other countermeasures as well. The second reason that they're reaching out, of course, is because this has a bearing on the Belt and Road. Now, this China-Pakistan economic corridor, ultimately, we do contest it. We consider it part of our territory. Pakistan considers it part of their territory. The consequences, the geopolitical costs go up for China. No other country wants to invest in a region which is a dispute between India and China and Pakistan, because ultimately, who will risk their investment? Now, if the road were to go through Afghanistan, that's an entirely different matter. It's not contested by anybody. So you are much more likely to get investments in that region if the road is not disputed. So I think if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, there are real concerns and real opportunities for them. But notwithstanding that, I think we should watch what the Chinese do, because they are a very cautious, deliberate people. And I don't think they're going to be in a hurry to recognize. The one point we can't ignore, of course, is that they are delighted that the United States has been humiliated. They're not alone in this. The Russians are delighted, so are the Iranians, and so are the Pakistanis. And that is because, I guess, the Americans in Afghanistan were much too close for comfort. Too close for comfort for the Chinese, too close for comfort for the Americans and for the Russians and the Iranians. So the point I want to make is, I don't think we should see Chinese outreach as necessarily something which is a positive one. We should wait and watch to see how they act. And my sense is that there will be deep concerns. They may not display them.
So on this note, I bring Samir Sumaya. He has a very different perspective on Indo-China relationship. His university has a Chinese center. Samir, would you like to frame your question, share your question with Mr. Gokhale and Nayanima?
No, I just had a question. Thank you. I have visited China a few times, and I have found that the Chinese people seem to have a great respect for India for having brought Buddhism into their country. And they, whenever we would say Indo, is how they would say, and they would look at it with great respect. So I was just wondering whether this sort of civilizational connect that we have that goes back centuries could be a soft dimension that we could use to build a different kind of bridge.
Yeah. Mr. Somaya, firstly, the Chinese consider, probably if they consider any civilization worthy of respect in Asia besides their own, it is without doubt India. They understand not only Buddhism, a lot of other wisdom, intellectual property came from India over the years, both by sea and by land, and the Chinese fully acknowledge it. And if you go to some of their sites, Tunhuang Caves, the Yunkang Grottos, in Loyang, the White Horse Temple, you can see obvious Indian influence in that region. Now, that having been said, there is very little scholarship which builds upon this cultural connect and brings it to the common people. So, an average school kid in India can give you a few examples about how we are connected to Persian civilization, Afghan civilization, maybe even Turkish civilization, Central Asian civilization through the Emperor Kanishk and the Kushans, how we are connected to the British because of colonialism and so on. Almost nobody can tell you about connections with China beyond Yuan Tsang. That's about the knowledge we have. And why is that so? That is because neither Indians nor Chinese, and this is equally true on the Chinese side, have invested in scholarship about each other. I'm teaching in a course in symbiosis in Pune, and I teach about diplomacy with the US and China. Now, we are talking to an educated bunch of postgraduates here. These are not people who are uneducated. They could name at least 8 or 9 American presidents, and they could name 20 American cities. They could not name anybody beyond Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. And let me tell you, beyond Beijing and Shanghai, they did not know a single city in China, although the first 20 cities in China are bigger in population to every American city except New York. Now, that should tell you something about our education system in terms of foreign policy. But equally, if you were to ask a Chinese to name, to talk about India, she or he would talk about snake charmers, caste, elephants, Hindu-Muslim problems. They wouldn't talk about the modern economy, about the fact that Indians are as digitally aware about using UPI to make payments, about the fact that IT software services lead in the world, about the fact that, Indians are running practically every major corporation in every continent. So this information gap is something that institutions have to build upon. And this is a growing challenge, because if or when we become 2 of the 3 largest economies of the world, if we don't have even a broad understanding of each other, misunderstandings are going to increase. And there is just that much diplomacy can do.
Mr. Gokhale, I just want to bring in here, there are some interesting nuggets here from Maharashtra. Do we remember, Dr. Kotnis Amar Kahani? Dr. Kotnis, do you think that, the legacy continues? Do you think that, Tagore's legacy when he invited Professor Tansun to Shanti Niketan will continue? You seem to be supporting this idea because there is a Maharashtra connection between Beijing and... So how do you look at that? I'm reflecting on Samir's query about the soft power or the soft aspect of diplomacy.
So both Rabindranath Tagore and Dwarkanath Kotnis are iconic figures in China. Because one, came to talk about the philosophy of the East and the revival of Eastern civilizations, and the other came to their help at a particularly difficult time when the Communist Party was virtually in exile in a place called Yan'an. But, examples, these are examples which are historical. You need modern examples as well. And I think there is a lack of modern examples. It's not that there aren't people equally inspirational even now, but they don't get written about. I mean, in this day and age, we have, I think, Nayanima, could you come in on this? My recollection is there are probably 3 Indian correspondents in China. Now, this is a country which is going to become the world's largest economy in this decade. It's going to be a $25 trillion economy. Surely we need more than 3 people reporting on it. So it starts there. Even the media, it's not, when will the media take China seriously? Stop posting correspondents to Paris, for instance, or London, and start looking at correspondents in Beijing. So, ultimately, all of us, society is responsible for this knowledge gap. The media, our educational institutions, our parliamentarians, our legislators, you cannot just blame the government. It has to be a whole of nation effort. Nayanima might want to defend the media, of course.
I think
no, sir, I agree. I totally agree. And I believe why just China? Even in Pakistan, we should have correspondence. But yes, China, more importantly, this is the biggest economy. When you talk about Belt and Road and their influence in the neighborhood, all the time sitting in Delhi, it really pains me at one point. And I think that is also one of the reasons why this time I really wanted to go to Kabul and understand that what is going on, unless you cannot sit here and listen to the same voices and write the same things. And I think what you said, sir, is very important, because I, being a history student myself from Delhi University, I very much realize how much we don't read Oriental history at all. And that is something Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon also keeps talking about all the time, that we need to now read a lot about Oriental history. There are so many books now, fortunately, I got my hands on this Empress Dowager Shiji. So I'm now reading about her, and how she was this empress who was once a concubine, and how the Opium War started. So we know so less, although we know everything about American Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, and everything else that we read in our history course, simple graduation history course. Even in masters, nobody takes Chinese history, or for that matter, Japanese history. So I think even Korean. So I think we really need to do that. The present generation has to understand, because I'm being a history student, I always believe you have to understand history to understand what is going in the present and what will happen in the future. So I think that's hugely important. And yes, I think we need to have at least 10 or 12 leading, publications posted there. I know editors will be upset because this comes with a lot of cost, but I think some publications did take that risk, and we've seen how brilliantly now, they report, and they know so much confidence that comes in their writing also, when you know about the place, the land, people, culture, everything. So I think that is, no, of course, I would not defend, but I think this is hugely needed if you really want to cover China from all aspects. That's hugely required, yes.
Nayanima, this gives me opportunity to formally really put it on record, the kindness and generosity of your founder editor, Shekhar Gupta. He was very, very supportive of this event. And he went beyond his constraints and told me that please go ahead, convey my regards to Mr. Gokhale and Nayanima. So there are people doing so much for China. I'm sure he's listening, and I'm sure that he's listening very seriously to Mr. Gokhale's suggestion of posting more and more people in Beijing, perhaps. And here is Samir Somaiya. I'm going to ask him, lob a question, perhaps a grenade. I'm going to lob a grenade at Samir. That you run Somaiya Vihar, you do so much. What's your next step about responding to Mr. Gokhale's suggestion about building that culture of Chinese study, or continuing the legacy of Dr. Kotnis and Tagore?
So we have actually got a program on Chinese studies on our campus. We've been teaching also Mandarin among many other languages on our campus. We teach a lot of other languages, Japanese, German. So but we speak Mandarin. And we've also been engaging with institutions in China, whether it is through our Center for Buddhist Studies, which we run on our campus, or other such programs. We do believe that China is, we have a civilizational link with China. We have a spiritual bridge with China. We also have a economic current day world with China, and they're a political neighbor and an economic trading partner we cannot ignore. And it is in the century which is we are living in now, China and Chinese are going to be important for us. For any country to work, they must know the whole world well, and more than that, they must know also their neighborhood well. And language is also a great medium to understand culture, the politics and the economics, and we will definitely try to know better.
Yeah. So, Mr. Gokhale, we are running out of time, and I have two questions from the campus. There is a large audience of young millennial students listening to us, encouraging us to continue the conversation. I'm sure we can run for hours together, this conversation. It's like a long game. So the conversation will continue. This conversation is going to. But the two questions, I'm going to provoke all of you, Samir, Nayanima, and Mr. Gokhale especially. Two questions coming up. One is that concern, and whether it's a question or is a future prediction, And my colleague, Kanti Bajpayee, expert on international relations, he also reflected on this question. Do you think that China can defeat us again militarily? A. And B, second question related to that. Do you think that China, if China ever becomes, global power, superpower, then how would the world look like? The two questions.
Yeah. So, the question is, the whole nature of military warfare is changing. I don't think we are going to, going forward, I don't think any country is looking at an outright victory where you will take over some other country. it is all going to be conflict for gaining an advantage for a specific purpose. So the question then is that does the hybrid warfare that countries are likely to wage, which includes cyber warfare, warfare in outer space, underwater warfare, use of drones, artificial intelligence and so on, is the Chinese capability better than ours? Now, the short point is that I believe that we are also doing fairly good research in all this at the educational and research level. But we are lacking one very major component in the of the digital economy, and that is the semiconductor industry. Ultimately, without semiconductors, nothing is going to run in the future. And so the question we ask ourselves is, can a country of 1.4 billion people continue down the road of not having its own semiconductor industry and being dependent on anybody else, friend or foe? That's not the issue. But being dependent on somebody else for the use of semiconductors. So I would say that if we, I can't predict as to whether there will be outright victory or not from China's side, but I would say we were vulnerable if we don't have an end-to-end capacity in semiconductors, because from artificial intelligence to playing video games, I mean, in all aspects of life, and particularly the pandemic has shown this, the digital world is going to become more and more relevant for us. So that is my view as far as this outright victory thing is concerned. As to how the world will look if China becomes a power is a very good question. I can confidently say that it will not look like the Western world, because the concept of hegemony in China is different from the concept of Western hegemony. Historically speaking, if you look at it, the Chinese have never thrust their ideas on the rest of the world. What they have demanded is, you take care of my interests and you accept me as the overlord, and then you do what you want. Now, whether this historical example holds true for the 21st century is something only Mr. Xi Jinping can tell you about. But certainly, we must get away from the notion that hegemony is what was defined beginning with the Roman Empire and ending with the American Empire. Because the West had a particular philosophy of how to deal with people and countries. But that's not the way we dealt historically, either we or the Chinese for that matter. So I think this requires study, but I don't know what it will look like, but I'm quite certain it won't look like the Western hegemony.
There is a side question coming here, if that becomes,
but maybe
real.
We need Nayanima's input on this.
Yeah, Nayanima. Yeah, so coming back, Nayanima too. If that becomes a possibility, Mr. Gokhale, what will be, how would India look like, Where would be India then? I mean, this is a concern,
Yeah, so I would certainly say that at many levels, our performance has not been bad. I mean, if you look at the pandemic has actually increased the digital footprint in India, although of course there is a digital divide. We have to admit there is a digital divide. Unfortunately, the less fortunate people don't have the access that the more fortunate have. But these are issues that other countries have resolved through policy and through other means, and we should be able to resolve it, I hope. The lack is really that we don't have a superior industrial base. And semiconductors is just one aspect of it. But ultimately, you need the hardware, and just producing the software is not good enough for a country of 1.4 billion. You won't be strategically autonomous or strategically independent. For instance, if you're dependent on aircraft engines for the West, you may be able to build the rest of the aircraft, but if there is no engine, it won't fly. And for the same reason, however sophisticated your software is, if you don't have a semiconductor, it won't work. And this is true across the board for defense and industrial technologies. You don't have a manufacturing base and without that, the software is just one part of it. So I think what we really need to focus on is building some of the key elements of hardware. I don't mean in an electronic sense, I mean in an industrial sense. Which will then take you to the next level. But I do believe that the Chinese have a sneaking respect for the intellect and capacity of the Indian. That's different from for what it thinks about the Indian economy. But it has respect for the Indian mind. I have no doubt about that.
That's a lovely phrase, sneaking, respect for Indian mind and intelligence.
Well, they never admit to anybody being superior than them, so I guess it has to be sneaky.
Yeah. Nayanima and Samir, please.
Well, I think Sir has given a superb answer. I believe, yes, I mean, the next warfare will be in the technology sector with 5G. We are already seeing what is going on. And I think, as Sir said, that, semiconductor is going to be the next big thing. It is already a big thing. But then, yes, for India, the challenge is you have to be self-reliant. Our manufacturing base is very low. I mean, we need to always rely on either on the Chinese or the Western powers to really for their manufacturing prowess to build the end product. I think that is something we really need to look at. And I think that is where probably Prime Minister has spoken about Atmanirbharta, but I do not know how much of that is really trickling down to the industry. But we need the right kind of policies also for that. But then, yes, I think that is where the Chinese know where Indians lack. And I think there is always this game between America and China about this high-tech products and high technology. And it seems that as if, India cannot be a player in that. So I think we need to be also a player in that kind of competition that goes on. And I think it is time for us to wake up to the reality that the world cannot always be divided between US and China, while they keep doing this superiority game all the time. Somehow I believe that they kind of have a tacit understanding that you be top in that, I'll be top in this. I think we have to break that chain, and for that we have a long way to go. It's not that easy, but then somewhere we have to start. And I think probably we can start by engaging more. We now talk about supply chains, post-COVID, post-pandemic supply chains. I do not know how that's going to work, but that's something we really need to activate in a major way and propel that, and probably take into account the potential that lies within the ASEAN region and Far East, and probably go ahead with it is what my point. Thanks.
Samir.
My response is institutions, organizations, companies or countries need to build their assets, whether they be physical, whether they be financial, and whether they be intellectual. And if you look at it in the last few years or the last few decades, China has systematically built its physical, financial, and intellectual assets. In the US, you've seen it, and the universities have led the intellectual charge. I think as India is concerned, I repeat, all three of us, meaning institutions, companies, and the country, have to work in tandem to build this for the nation, all these three aspects. It cannot be one at the expense of the other two. It cannot be two at the expense of the third. We have to systematically, constantly, every moment look at how we are building towards these three assets. That will make for the strength of the country, and that will only with these three assets we will have respect in the world.
Thank you, Samir, for your wonderful closing remarks, and thank you, Mr. Gokhale and Mr. Nayanima, Basu, for joining this conversation. We look forward to the next episode of Long Game. The long game will stay with us, and I look forward. Here is the long game. Here's the long game.
Thank you, Nayanima.
And also, I'm looking at the possibility of perhaps the title. Maybe you can suggest to your publisher for your new book, Buddha in Foreign Office. Look forward to reading your stories in the Foreign Office.
Thank you.
So all the best from Kitabkhana, and friends and writers who are listening to us, please visit Kitabkhana, and please do buy the Long Game, and write back to Mr. Vijay Gokhale, Nayanima, and also Print. Thank you very much, Print, and Penguin. Thank you very much, Penguin, for being with us. Thank you, sir. Thank you, and thank you, Mansi, for organizing this event so efficiently. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.